We've got a measles outbreak in West Texas, people. It's time for some EMS, emergency medical scripture, because Christianity and the sciences do not contradict, they cooperate for the flourishing of mankind unto the glory of God. I'm St. K. You're listening to the Foreign Saints podcast, keeping Christianity distinct in a world that wants to water us down. And I got my scrub cap on, scrub shirt, stethoscope on, because I'm speaking not just as St. K, the committed Christian, the committed disciple maker, but also as Kari Rowe, registered respiratory therapist in the state of North Carolina. I'm wearing both hats today as we talk about this topic, measles, the outbreak in West Texas, and what the wisdom of God has to say about the matter and about vaccines. Is there wisdom in the scripture that speaks into this topic of vaccines and disease prevention? And if so, what is it? And in what direction does it seem to lead us? All questions that we as Christians need to seriously consider, I think, because our walk with Jesus is holistic. It's not myopic. It's not just singled into one or two or three different dimensions of our life. Jesus is king. He rules over all, and so we need to let his words speak into all. And so we're going to be doing that today, right? We're going to be learning about what measles is, what it does, how it hurts us, learning some things about the immune system, how it operates, why vaccines, I would say, are effective, and just seeing what there is to see and hopefully dissecting our own desires along the way to see what it is that really motivates us and to also see the damage that lies can do when it comes to misinformation and things like that. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Let me go ahead and pull up Logos so that you guys can see what I see. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 12. This right here is our wisdom foundation that we are starting from today. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. All right. And we also see the same verse appear earlier in Proverbs. Let me show you. Proverbs 22, verse 3. The same thing is written here. The prudent sees danger and hides himself. The simple go on and suffer for it. So what we see in this verse is the prudent, the wise, contrasted with the simple, the fool. And you can tell their difference by their actions. It's actually a theme in Proverbs, right? That wisdom showcases itself in actions and speech. And so by a person's action and speech, you should be able to determine if they're wise or not, namely you, right? And if you determine yourself to be a fool, you should chase after wisdom more than anything. Answer her call. But what we see here is that the prudent, the wise, does two things. They're shown to be prudent or wise by the two things that they do. The first thing they do is that they see the danger. There's an actual danger out there in the world, and with their eyes, they do actually see it. And secondly, they hide themselves from said danger. That's the thing that marks them as prudent, right? Um, the simple, however, does three things. All right. They see danger with their eyes, they see danger, but they go on as if they hadn't, right? The simple go on and suffer for it. They continue their walk through life as if the danger they saw was not really a true thing that they saw. And thirdly, they suffer as a result because they saw danger and because they didn't act on what they saw. They suffered for it. They suffered from the danger that they saw but didn't hide themselves from, right? And so this is a point of wisdom, right? The book of Proverbs is about general points of wisdom, generally applicable points of wisdom. These are not hardcore rules, right? You should read the rest of the wisdom literature to see what I'm talking about, right? The next book, Ecclesiastes, after Proverbs, is, I wouldn't quite say like a book of exceptions, but it does poke against this and say, yes, wisdom is good, but it's, in every case, it's not like it's a guarantee that things are going to go well, right? And then you get the book after Ecclesiastes, which is Job, right? A man that feared God, right? Lived according to wisdom as best he knew how, but things still happened in his life. And so in in the wisdom literature, you see this presentation of wise precepts and this kind of held in tension with the reality that we live in a fallen world, and so these wise precepts don't actually always bear the fruit that you think they will. And how do we walk in faith within that tension, right? This is an episode where we're not talking about exceptions, we're focused on generalities, right? Because you can't have exceptions unless you have generalities. You can't have nuance unless you have black and white. There's no such thing as gray without black and white as the context for the gray, right? So something I want to say about this is that when it comes to, I think this piece of wisdom has application in the medical world and the sciences, right? Because you're going to use your common sense, but also for the most part, you're going to use scientific investigation to determine if something is a danger or dangerous. And you're also going to use scientific investigation along with some common sense to determine what the best way to hide ourselves from this danger would be, right? And so, with this framework, we need to ask ourselves a question. Measles, is it a seen danger? Is it a seen danger? Because if it is, the wisdom of God in Proverbs definitely advises us to hide ourselves from it, right? And we can have that, and we're going to have that discussion later about what does it mean to hide yourself from something like measles. Um, but before we can get into that, we have to establish whether or not it's even a danger, because there's been a lot of I would say misinformative propaganda going around about measles, that it's not actually as bad as people make it out to be. And so to combat that, we got to look at truth. We got to look at what the data actually says, right? And so one of the things that is true about measles is that it's one of the deadlier pathogens that humans have fought in our time on this cursed earth, right? And so just the book that I wanted to show you guys is this book. Oh, sorry, camera's in a new place now. Immune, um, A Journey into the Mysterious System That Keeps You Alive by Philip Detmer. If you're curious and you want to do a slightly more casual deep dive into the immune system, I would recommend you pick this book up on Amazon or Kindle, or you look up their YouTube videos. Right, creator of Course Guard. Right. You look up that funky looking Greek word on YouTube, you can find their videos quite informative. Yeah. Let's go ahead and jump to page 230. Pages 230 to 231 from this book, Immune. All right, I'm going to be reading paragraphs 1, 2, 3, paragraphs 4, 5, and 7. Right. So this is what this book has to say about measles. The measles virus is extraordinarily infectious, considerably more infectious than the novel coronavirus, for example. Similar to many other viruses, measles spreads through coughs and sneezes and floats through the air in tiny droplets that stay airborne for up to 2 hours. If you have measles, you're so contagious that 90% of all susceptible people that come close to you will be infected just by being in your vicinity. So if you have it and other non vaccinated people share a subway, train, or a classroom with you, it's highly likely that you will infect others. Let's see. The favorite victims of measles are your T and B cells, but especially your long lived plasma and memory B and T cells that are vulnerable to the virus. Measles is targeting the actual living, breathing memory part of your immune system, and at the peak, millions, if not billions, of your immune cells may be infected. Don't worry, we'll talk about what that means later on in this episode, right? You can look down at the chapter divisions that I made to jump around if you so desire. I would recommend that you listen to it in one shot, but I know how we are. um, and lastly, being infected with measles erases the capacity of the immune system to protect you from the diseases that you overcame in the past. Even worse, a measles infection can wipe away the protection that you might have gained from other vaccines, since most vaccines create memory cells. Therefore, in the case of measles, what does not kill you makes you weaker, not stronger. Measles causes irreversible, long term harm, and it maims and kills children. That would be Immune's word on the matter, right? Now, he said that it's more infectious than COVID-19. That's true. Flu, right? COVID-19 is 2 to 4 times more infectious than the flu, and measles is more infectious than COVID, right? Let me go ahead and pull up this article from the New England Journal of Medicine. Let me slide that right in here. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, in a room full of 100 people, one person being positive for measles will result in 12 to 18 more people in the group getting measles. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean by that. Yep, and here it is right here. This is a article called Measles from the New England Journal of Medicine. You can see your authors right here, published July 10th, 2019. And you can see here, measles virus is one of the most highly contagious human pathogens known. In a 100% susceptible population, a single case of measles results in 12 to 18 secondary cases on average. 2 doses of measles-containing vaccine is the standard of care for the prevention of measles. All right. Now, measles. The other thing that our book Immune mentioned is that measles targets the memory B and memory T cells of your immune system. And having a bunch of those guys die off quickly is like your immune system getting amnesia or a factory reset to default settings, or close to default settings anyway, because the memory B and T cells, their entire job is to remember, what you've fought before to speed up your heavy weapon response time of the immune system. Well, I'll explain all that later. But measles can literally undo the effectiveness of that response, right? And so that's a problem, right? Measles kind of like, if measles doesn't kill you, which it can from a lot of different things, a lot of different mechanisms, it paves the way for other things to take you out that, if you had a functioning immune system, might not have been able to stand a chance against someone as awesome as you, you know? Now, as far as this outbreak of measles in West Texas, what I can tell you is that in the counties of Gaines, Lynn, Terry, and Yoakum in West Texas, if I'm saying that right, in the U.S., we've seen a measles outbreak. Small scale, but hopefully nothing too major, too much more major comes of it. After the time I did a lot of the research for this episode, it came out that a child unfortunately died. At least one child has died. I certainly hope it's not any more than that. All right. But let me go ahead and show you. Let me go ahead and show you some things that I've been looking at here. Let me go and pull this up. I've been using Ground News as one of my research tools, and I really do like Ground News, right? It gives you a bird's eye view of news stories, and what I mean by that is that you're not just reading one source like the Times or one source like CNBC. You can look at a bunch of different sources on any single story, right? And you can see their factuality rating. You can see where they lean politically as far as how they write, leaning left, leaning right, whatever. You can see their factuality habits, mixed factuality, high factuality, very high, right? All that stuff is good stuff, right? I don't have any kind of, I don't have any, there's no sponsorship with Ground News. I just think it's a very useful tool. All right. They've got a bias they've got like a bias rating system that they use. Let me go ahead and show you this. Uh, they show you, um, you know, how a certain source leans politically and what they mean by their labels of far left, left, far right, right. You can come down to the factuality score, an overall assessment of a news publication's reporting practices, right? From very low to very high and everything in between. You can see ownership categories as well. This is the sort of thing that I like to use because I believe, as a Christian, as someone that claims to believe in a God named Truth, I definitely want to be rigorous in how I get to truth. I want to make sure that I'm not falling for information in my research that I'm getting to the heart of the matter. And so these are just the different methods that I use, right? Ground news to be able to check, to be able to fact check the reporting of different news sites. If we're talking about medicine, using accredited medical journals as one of my first line places to go to research these things. Again, I want to empower you, the Christian, to be able to do good research on your own, so that way Satan and the enemy and the kingdom of darkness aren't able to manipulate you on some pseudo religious trash, as has been happening quite a bit in our time. All right. Now, at the time that I was digging into all this stuff, um, there were only 48 confirmed cases of measles. But in the space of, about a week, we've already jumped up to approaching 150, right? Which is absolutely wild. All right. 150 cases. At the time that I did the research, it was only 48 cases of measles, mostly in young kids. Only 6 of those 48 were outside of Gaines County. And Gaines County, West Texas, has one of the highest vaccine exemption rates in the state. Um, Between 2023 and 2024, 17.62% of kindergartners received exemptions from vaccines. And there was one school district in particular within Gaines County that had a vaccine exemption rate for entering kindergartners of 47.95%. This means that 52.05% of children got vaccinated. That's barely over half. And the minimum percentage required to achieve herd immunity for measles is 94 to 95%. But that brings up a new term, herd immunity. What is herd immunity? It is, and catch this, this is important, people. Herd immunity is the percent of a population that needs to be immune to a disease, that needs to be vaccinated against the disease to prevent the spread of that infectious disease within that population. So let me go ahead and show you my actual notes for this episode so that you can have the visual, right? For COVID, right, 70 to 90%, depending on which strain of COVID we're talking about, as low as 70 or as high as 90% of the population needs to be inoculated against it to prevent the easy spread of COVID through a population. For the flu, surprisingly, it's 50%, but it's 50% if you're only dealing with a single strain of flu. Most flu seasons are dealing with multiple species of flu, multiple strains of flu. And so that would be why it doesn't always seem like 50%, but the flu virus, it mutates so fast and incubates for such a short period of time that it can sort of work around its own limits. But that's another episode for another time. Polio, 80%, a minimum 80% of the population should be getting a polio shot if you want to prevent the easy spread of polio within your community. Ebola, as far as I saw in my research, we don't actually have an Ebola vaccine yet, but it is in the works. And so this is an estimate based on a vaccine that would be 80% effective. A more effective vaccine would result in a lower predicted herd immunity percentage. Get it? Got it? Good. 53 to 79% of the population would need to have this proto vaccine for Ebola to prevent the easy spread of Ebola within the population. And then you come to measles, 95% at a minimum. 94 to 95% at a minimum in your population need to be vaccinated against measles to prevent the easy spread of measles throughout, throughout the population. Measles, to my research, seems to easily be the most difficult virus to create herd immunity for and maintain, because you only got a 5 to 6% margin of non margin of exemptions, I guess you could say, before you're entering into outbreak territory, right? um and this sort of thing kind of reminds me of Jesus and Christians, right? Because with enough of us, with enough Christians in a population, we can be as salt and light, and prevent the spread of sin within a culture that causes its decay. But less than a certain percentage won't slow sin down as much as you'd like to in a culture, but each individual Christian will still be protected from the rampant sin of the culture themselves by knowing Jesus personally. And it's the same thing with vaccines, right? Even, if you're the only one in your community that got a measles shot, then you're protected, but because you're the only guard against measles, you're not going to be able to do much, right? And again, this really shouldn't surprise us, right? God built this world to teach us love, right? We can be affected by the harmful actions of other people, right? The consequences of other people's bad actions can overflow onto us, even though we did nothing to deserve it. But by the same token, the good consequences of our loving actions also overflow onto other people who technically did nothing to deserve it, right? Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting how that works. All right. Something to look at here. I keep on exiting out of the screen share, and I need to just switch the tab that I'm sharing. But we're going to be referencing this article quite a bit here in our next section. But just some data I wanted you to see. This right here is a graph from the New England Journal of Medicine showing the number of cases of measles reported each year in the United States from 1960 to 2019. All right. And so you can see right here, across do I remember my graphing right? Across the x-axis, we have dates and times, and up the y-axis, we have reported cases of measles in the hundreds of thousands. So 1960, you're looking at, let's see, 1960 to 1962, looks like it peaks at just over 450,000, coming up on 500,000 cases. The vaccine is licensed around 1963, 1964. And then within a couple years, before the decade is even out, after the vaccine is licensed, we're dropping off from above 400,000 cases of measles to, it's barely perceptible on this graph. The biggest bar I've seen is, close to 100,000, but by the time we get to 1980, 1982, it's completely gone. Quick little blip around 1990, and then it is flat. There is nothing on this graph. Moving up to the year 2000, and then, things start to pick up again a little bit. 2014, we see a spike. 2018, 2019, we see a spike. A gigantic spike in measles cases, not anywhere near the hundreds of thousands. We're talking up in the thousands, which is crazy. Like, you look at this graph, and we managed to eradicate measles to such a degree that by the time you get to 2000, we're counting measles cases in the hundreds, and in the not even in the hundreds. They're two-digit numbers until we come back to recent times. And so I understand that if you compare, 1,000 cases in the U.S. in a year doesn't seem that bad compared to six-figure numbers. Oh no, yeah, I agree. It's not that bad. But do you want to be moving in a reverse direction, or do you want to keep a positive direction? Right? And I think it's also telling that 2019 is also, the year we start to see a lot of, anti-vax rhetoric pick up. We start to see a lot of the COVID distrust start to set into people around this time, or beginning in this time. And commensurate with that, at the same time, correlative to that going on in society, we see the biggest spike in measles cases that we've had since its declaration of eradication in 2000. Coincidence? I don't think so. Okay, I don't think so. And it's at this point, I think, that we need to have a short but helpful meditation. A short but helpful meditation. Catch this, people. Israel had no vaccines. Israel had no vaccines. Ancient Israel, there was not, no shots, no jabs in sight. So, what did they do to hide themselves from diseases? What did they do? I'll show you. All right, I'll show you. God made them quarantine. which I know is a scary word for some of y'all, but let's look at what our great and beautiful God did. Leviticus, let me spell the word right. Leviticus chapter 13. Leviticus chapter 13. Now, put your thinking caps on, people, because we're going to be bouncing between this and that New England Journal of Medicine article to really tie it all together. All right. This right here, we see laws about leprosy, right? Um, and I did a episode with goodness gracious, the title's blanking on me. No, Christian, forgive me. On the Let Nothing Move You podcast. Goodness gracious, on the Let Nothing Move You podcast, did an episode talking about this particular chapter and the chapter that follows, showing the tie-ins to Jesus Christ, the typology, but also just talking about the health aspects here and what did leprosy really mean. It was a lot more encompassing than just Hansen's disease, more than that. But go check out his podcast and listen to that episode, and then I'll probably listen to a few more episodes. You can learn something from our friend over there, scholar to the people, Christian Ashley. But let's look at what the scripture says here. Leviticus chapter 13, verses 1 to 3. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. Was it the CDC that spoke? No. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priests, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. Now, the rest of this chapter goes on to describe the various things that the priest might find upon physical exam, right? And which of those things counted as being declared clean or being declared unclean. When you come down to the end of the chapter, or the end of this section anyway, we get to verse 45. The leprous person who has the disease, right? Whatever of the earlier diseases it was determined that you have, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out. He'll cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. And before people get all up in arms, because I had a microbiology professor when I was doing my prerequisites for respiratory therapy bring up these Levitical laws and declare them, unjust and backwards and all this stuff, and pushing discrimination and all that. In my personal experience, I don't think she read. Which brings me to my obligatory motto drop for the show. All you gotta do is read. That's all you got to do. All you got to do is read. Stop making up your narratives about what the Bible says and just read the Bible. That's all you got to do. Just read the Bible. You don't have to make it up. If you don't like it, you don't like it. But stop making up crap that you didn't read in the Bible. Nowhere in here is it putting the leprous person down. All right, let's take a look at what Jesus said about the law in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. When a Jewish lawyer asked him, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus asks him, what's written in the law and how does he read it? The lawyer answers with, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Then Jesus doesn't correct him. He says, You've answered correctly. Do this and you'll live. All right. So the entire law can be summed up in love God with everything you got and love your neighbor as yourself, which begs the question of, well, how is this? How is this at the end of Leviticus 13 showing love to your neighbor as yourself? How are these quarantining laws doing that? I would argue by preventing the spread of easily communicable diseases within Israel. And history backs me up on this. I mean, go look it up, right? During Europe's Black Plague, the Jewish community was noticeably spared a lot of the damage of the Black Plague because they held to these principles and other cleanliness guidelines that were laid out by the Lord through Moses in other chapters in Leviticus that we don't have time to get into. But catch what's happening here. If God had no problem with uprooting someone and having their whole life up to that point potentially be uprooted as well, then I don't see why any able-bodied Christian, key caveat there, able-bodied Christian, should pursue a vaccine exemption for a safe and effective vaccine that does not require any of that. All right? First Corinthians 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23. Oh my goodness, man. Why can't I spell books of the Bible, man? 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23. All things are lawful, quote unquote. The Corinthian church was saying to Paul, all things are lawful. Paul's rebuttal, yes, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, they would say at the church of Corinth. Paul's rebuttal, but not all things build up. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. But the good of his neighbor. All right, that's a principle, that's a virtue. Remember how I've been saying on this channel, virtue ethics is what we do. If you don't understand the virtues, you don't understand the rules. This is the virtue. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. How do we apply that virtue in certain sticky situations? Well, read the rest of this section and you'll see why, right? But whatever we do, whether we eat or drink, whatever, however we practice our health care even, do it all to the glory of God, right? And so this is just where I got to tease and poke a little bit, how we do on the Foreign Saints. We have a lot of internal critique here on Foreign Saints because judgment begins in the house of God. And Paul says of, the spiritual man, if he judges himself, will be judged by no one. All right. So let's make sure that we're doing a lot of cleaning and maintenance in our own spiritual house before you want to start going poking fingers at the democrats and all this other stuff, right? Because some of y'all hearing this on the right would have called me a liberal for suggesting that God commanded Israel to quarantine. And that might sound crazy to you. But I promise you, man, I have led Bible studies. With conservative Christians that have called me a liberal for simply saying stuff like that, right? I've not even mentioned policy. All I'm doing is reading. And all of a sudden, we're in these political weeds instead of just dealing with what the scripture actually says, right? Listen, if that makes you uncomfortable, it's because you have a conservative version of God in your head that does not agree with reality. You've allowed the leaven of Herod, aka political hypocrisy, to infect your religion. What do I mean by that? Mark chapter 8, verse 15. Jesus, giving a warning to his followers, he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, right? He says elsewhere that the leaven of the Pharisees is hypocrisy. The same thing with the leaven of Herod, hypocrisy, political hypocrisy, where you're willing to, sell your religious commitments away because of your more important political commitments, right? The Pharisees were hypocrites in that they claimed a religious standard. They washed the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they were full of greed and wickedness and dead man's bones, right? Right? They did a lot of behavior modification. They did a lot of this stuff to look good to the outside world, but they weren't useful to the king. Political hypocrisy is similar. You're still not useful to the king, but for a different reason. It's because you claim a commitment to the kingdom of Jesus, but in reality, your commitment is to a different kingdom. And so, when unbelievers see your hypocritical lives, your hypocritical stances, it's like seeing spit on the beautiful face of Messiah. That makes it more difficult for people to see him clearly because they're tripped up by you. All right. And so with all that, being said, again, let's look back at Leviticus Let me look back at Leviticus here. Let me actually get back here. Oh dear. Where did I leave it? Where did I leave Leviticus? I gotta actually type it in again. Leviticus 13. All right. When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, right? A swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease, right? Now it clarifies down below. So you get like a spot or something like that, and a singular spot isn't that bad. But if it breaks out into a full-blown rash across the face or across the body, now we're entering into unclean territory. Now we're entering into territory where we're going to have to quarantine him for a little bit. Again, go read Leviticus 13. It's not like for certain things, it wasn't like you were instantly put into full-blown quarantine. There were some things that were temporary quarantines for, a week, 2 weeks, and see if it clears up. But let me come back here to the New England Journal of Medicine. Right, and let me show you what this article is even all about. I think you guys will find it interesting. All right, the New England Journal of Medicine has quite a few different kinds of articles. A clinical practice is one of them. All right, and so let me just read it. This journal feature begins with a case vignette highlighting a common clinical problem. Evidence supporting various strategies is then presented, followed by a review of formal guidelines when they exist. The article ends with the author's clinical recommendations. All right, so let's look at the case that they present, the hypothetical case they present, and I want you to be thinking about if this case presented itself in ancient Israel, is this the kind of case that the Levitical priests would have had to quarantine for the health safety of the community? I want you to be thinking about that as I read this. I'll do my best to translate any difficult potential jargon here for you as we go. All right. So, a 38-year-old man presents to his primary care physician with a 3-day history of fever and cough. He is a father of 2 children, his wife is pregnant, and he has a history of recent travel outside the U.S. The physical examination is notable for a body temperature of 39 degrees Celsius. For all of us Americans, that's 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Conjunctivitis, he's got red eyes, and rhonchi on chest auscultation. Chest auscultation just means you're listening with a stethoscope. Rhonchi, the word we tend to use a lot is junky, you sound congested. The physician suspects bronchitis, and because of course he would. Because of course he would suspect bronchitis. Because, sure, we're in America, but measles is supposed to be eradicated, right? That's not something that's going to be high in my list of differential diagnoses here, man. You got a 3-day history of fever and cough. You got rhonchi. You got congestion. You got a temperature. Yeah. Bronchitis seems like a good bet. And most of the time, you'd probably be right. The physician suspects bronchitis and prescribes antibiotic agents. 2 days later, the patient returns with a red blotchy rash over his face and trunk. Uh-oh. The antibiotics aren't working because measles is a virus, not a bacteria. So your antibiotic isn't going to touch it. But 2 days later, the patient returns, a red blotchy rash over his face and trunk. Back to the Bible. When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. Oh dear. Our hypothetical person here has just reached the threshold for Levitical examination. This is not good. And because this is ancient Israel, we don't have the fancy ICUs, you don't have the fancy medical tech to be able to deal with this if this is a problem. So all you can really do is quarantine. That's all you can really do. But look at this. The physician becomes concerned about the possibility of measles. Of course, He does. But here's the question. How should this case be further evaluated and managed? How might measles have been prevented? And what can be done to prevent the spread of the disease within the patient's family and community? So, all the people out there that think that medical professionals don't care about prevention, no, you're wrong. Prevention is like most of the questions that this particular, what do they call it, clinical practice article focuses on, right? You have one question about management. How should this case be further evaluated and managed? That's the present. The rest of this is talking about prevention. How might measles have been prevented? What can be done now to prevent the spread of the disease within the patient's family and community? Right? Well, obviously, getting the vaccine, right? But before we go into the rest of, some more things of what this article has to show us here, there's something else that we need to be talking about. And it's this: how your immune system works 101, right? Very 101. All right. Big props. So I'm used to pointing up there because the camera's usually been on top of the monitor, but it's here. It's to my right now. Thank you, Christian Ashley, for again just helping me, kind of test these notes, test this. So I've got it on Christian Ashley's authority of the Let Nothing Move You podcast that the following presentation is easily understandable. If it's not, don't direct your angry comments to me. Go to his podcast, direct your angry comments to him. I've just helped your algorithm out there, Christian. All right. But how your immune system works, 101. All right. What is its purpose? Its purpose, obviously, is to protect you from bacteria, from viruses, etc. But I think a better definition that might stick in some of y'all's mind a bit better. The same definition actually that immune uses. Again, check this book out. I really like it. To protect you from the potentially harmful other, the not you that's out there, right? Because all the cells in your body come with what you might call flags or chemical name tags, perhaps, that have your face stamped on them, right? And so your immune system, one of the ways your immune system checks for invaders is by seeing if cells are carrying the right flags, right? That cell right there is flying a flag that's different than the body's flag. Kill it. Or in the case of cancer, that cell isn't flying a flag, but it should be flying the body's flag. So we're going to consider it hostile and kill it anyway, right? At its most basic, the entire immune system rests on the ability to distinguish you from not you and then aggressively destroying the not you, right? When your immune system can't tell the difference between what's you and what's not you, that's where pretty much every autoimmune issue comes from, right? Almost every. That's where a lot of your autoimmune system issues come from. Your immune system is attacking your own body, treating your body as other than you. And that's a problem, right? But there are three basic tiers of security that the immune system has at its disposal. You've got your physical barriers of entry, right? Your skin, your mucus and snot, right? Those tonsils there in the back of your throat, your sneezing and coughing reflex, the vomiting reflex, even all of that keeps the not you out of you, right? At a physical level. It's the door, it's the wall, it's the gate. You can't come through here. The moat in some cases. And then you've got level 2, the innate immune system, right? Now, my little nickname for this is immune's nickname for this, right? Your general purpose defense, your frontline soldiers, and what I would also term your war photographers, right? Most of the defense is actually carried by your general purpose defense, by your frontline soldiers. And this part of your immune system, you're born with it. It's ready to go, pretty much almost from birth. The weapons that your general purpose defense has at its disposal are generalized. They're general weapons. They're not tailored to specific enemy species. But you also have war photographers, specifically the dendritic cell, which gathers intelligence, right? There's this big old fight raging, you know what I mean? The example used in the book Immune, you pierce your skin with a rusty nail, lets in a whole bunch of bacteria, right? So your general purpose defenders rush to the scene. How do they rush to the scene? Through fluid. That's why you get inflammation. The fluid rushes there. That's what brings the frontline defenders there to fight. So all that fighting is going on. Meanwhile, you've got this dendritic cell who's kind of like a war photographer, right? He's taking samples of bits and pieces of dead enemy types, and then he's gonna bring those bits and pieces of dead enemy types back to the lymph nodes to answer 3 questions. How dangerous is this enemy? What kind of enemy is this? And do we need to call for reinforcements? And that's where the third and final tier of the immune system, well, not final, but for the sake of your 101 course, we'll say it's the final tier of the immune system, the adaptive immune system. So we covered innate. Now we're talking about adaptive immune system, what I call the specific defense, right? Your innate immune system is general purpose defense. The adaptive immune system is specific defense, right? Your bioweapon R&D archives, your bioweapon research and development archives, the adaptive immune system. What does it do? A bunch of things. It supports the innate system, right? When it's not doing its own thing, it's supporting the innate system intricately. But its unique roles would be to create antibodies. It only deals with a smaller amount of defense, right? Your bioweapon R&D archives aren't called in unless you're really dealing with a problem. They create specialized soldier cells built for the current specific enemy, and and the reason I use the term archives, the way that Immune describes it, and you should go look up this video. Maybe I'll link it. I might link that video to this video when I upload this. They would say that your immune system has at its disposal the largest library in the universe, which is what I call the archives, which has records of every possible antigen, and an antigen is simply an enemy protein piece, right? It has records of every possible antigen that has existed, does exist, or could ever come into existence. This system sounds perfect. It's not perfect, but it sounds perfect, right? And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, if I've got something like this, then, Kari, it sounds like you're making the case that I don't need vaccines at all because I've got this amazing bioweapon R&D archives. Yes, but it's not ready at birth. It's not ready at birth. Yeah, I said it. It's not ready at birth. It needs a few years to boot up and be refined before it's of any use. Which brings me to the question of why are vaccines a thing when the archives are a thing? Because babies don't have a useful archive. It's there, but it's blank of entries, right? The entries in the archive come through, DNA recombination over the course of multiple years to build up, and through exposure. Um, you know, Breast milk from mothers contain antibodies that were created by the mother's bioweapon R&D archives. The assumption being that it's very likely that the child is likely to only encounter the things that mom has antibodies for, so the little one can borrow mom's while their little body boots up. Um, but if the baby encounters something that its frontline soldiers, that its general purpose defense can't fully deal with, then there are no reinforcements for them to call. The baby will die when the frontline soldiers are either overwhelmed or when the collateral damage from the battle with the immune system becomes too great. Vaccines can give the babies archive entries on measles, mumps, rubella, etc., without having to create full-fledged battle and war within their tiny, vulnerable bodies. That way, if the baby does encounter the real thing, there are reinforcements from their young bioweapon R&D archives for their frontline soldiers to call on. All right? The same principle holds true for adults, by the way. Infections kill in part because they manage to do lethal damage. The fighting between the immune system and the infection causes lethal collateral damage before your bioweapon R&D archives can deploy sufficient reinforcements to stem the invasion. Vaccines give the immune system the chance to create memory cells easily, right? Memory B cells, they're like an antibody sprinkler system, right? You set it and forget it. Just constantly spewing out antibodies against a specific thing that you've encountered, giving you an immunity. And memory T cells, specialized fighting cells that are trained assassin like, but they're only useful against one enemy type. But if that enemy type shows up, between the memory T and B cells, you don't stand much of a chance, man. The memory cell's only job is to remember, right? If they encounter the remembered enemy, they get to skip the very long process of war photographer dendritic cells bringing photos back to bioweapon R&D in the lymph nodes, then those guys searching the archive network for an entry that matches the war photo brought by the dendritic cell. After that, they have to take that entry and start actually producing antibodies and specified super soldiers to be deployed against the enemy, right? All of that whole process takes time, and hopefully you don't die from the infection before that process is done, or before it's outlived its usefulness, before you're outside the window to win. Memory cells, on the other hand, come equipped with the relevant antibody from the start, and if they recognize an old foe, they instantly start blasting out antibodies at the start of battle, not multiple days into the battle. Recall the top of this episode when I told you that measles targets both kinds of memory cells, right? Let me go ahead and bring that back from our immune book, right? Let me reread what he says, right? The favorite victims of measles are your T and B cells, but especially the long-lived plasma and memory B and memory T cells that are vulnerable to the virus. Measles is targeting the actual living, breathing memory part of the immune system, right? Being infected with measles erases the capacity of the immune system to protect you from the diseases that you overcame in the past, because the memory cells, whose job is to remember the stuff that you overcame in the past, are killed by measles. You're actually losing immunity from measles, right? So, with all that being said, as we come back to the Bible, and we go back to our wisdom literature, the prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. Measles, I would say, based on the objective scientific evidence, is a seen danger. It's a danger, and it's seen because it's recorded. Got all the data on it, right? So how do we effectively hide from it? In the case of measles, with all the evidence we have at our disposal, vaccinate, to me, seems to be the obvious answer, right? But I know what some, I know what some objections to that would be, and I've come prepared to deal with some of those objections. The first objection that I can anticipate is people believing that the MMR vaccine causes autism, but the truth is no. The truth is no. The study in question was retracted. All right, let me go ahead and blow this tab up a little bit here. A report published in 1998, but subsequently retracted by the journal, suggested that measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine causes autism. However, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that has a strong genetic component with genesis before 1 year of age, when MMR vaccine is typically administered. Several epidemiologic studies have not found an association between MMR vaccination and autism, including a study that found that MMR vaccine was not associated with an increased risk of autism, even among high-risk children whose older siblings had autism. There were other reasons for why that particular study, by Wakefield was retracted. All right. You had a small sample size of only 12 children to work with, and with that small sample size, it was an uncontrolled study. There was no control group to compare. The conclusions were speculative, right? Obviously, there was not a strong logical link between the data presented in the study and the conclusions in that same study. Also, the financial interests of the people that were making that study were not disclosed. Wakefield had been funded by lawyers who had been engaged by parents in lawsuits against vaccine producing companies. That is definitely a bias right there. They were guilty of ethical violations as well, a couple different ethical violations, actually. They did invasive investigation on the kids without necessary ethical clearances being obtained first. There, it was falsely reported. There was false reporting going on that their sampling was consecutive when it was actually selective. And what that means is that they were picking and choosing the data that suited their case for financial gain. It's deliberate fraud, right? Their data wasn't consecutive, and that we're seeing this happen one thing after the other. We're picking and choosing, we're cherry picking the cases that, if we look at just those, make it easy to say that the MMR vaccine has a link to autism, when in reality, when you looked at all the data present in their study, it didn't actually say that. And the final nail in the coffin, there were 12. There were 12 authors, 12 co-authors, part of that original study. 10 of the 12 co-authors on the original MMR vaccine causes autism study have recanted. They've gone back on what they said. This is their quote, that no causal link was established between the MMR vaccine and autism, as the data was insufficient. The data was insufficient. And hey, like I said, if you don't trust me, then go and look at the data yourself. Go and look at the data yourself. Let me go ahead and show you again. Let me go ahead and just have this up on screen. This is the article. There were other articles I found as well, but this one's from the National Library of Medicine. Go check it out. Go look at their sources down at the bottom. Go check and see that what I'm saying is accurate. All right. Another objection that I anticipate people having is the objection of, well, how do I know that the MMR vaccine is reliable? You're telling me, I'm not trying to put this poison in my body. I want it to be reliable. Okay, that's fine. But don't be a hypocrite. Don't say that you want evidence and then never search for evidence. Right? Don't play the internet atheist. Don't play the internet skeptic and cry for evidence, but never put in the time to look for it. Don't be like that. Don't be like that. Back to the New England Journal of Medicine. All right. Let's see. Measles globally. Diagnosis, management. Vaccine effectiveness. Field studies of the effectiveness of the measles vaccine have found high effectiveness after one dose administered at the age of 12 months or later. Median effectiveness, 93%, and even higher effectiveness after 2 doses. The World Health Organization recommends 2 doses of measles-containing vaccine as the standard of care for the prevention of measles in all countries. 2 doses are needed to reach herd immunity threshold and terminate transmission. And vaccine-induced immunity is probably lifelong in the vast majority of vaccines. And again, just more data on this. 50 years of licensure. The vaccine has been licensed for over 50 years now. And with more than 100 million doses administered worldwide each year since 2000, measles-containing vaccines have a well-established safety record. The MMR vaccine has an acceptable side effect profile. Adverse events include fever, transient rashes occurring 7 to 12 days after vaccination, transient lymphadenopathy, parotitis, and aseptic meningitis. Serious adverse events are rare and much less common than the risks associated with natural measles infection, including anaphylaxis, febrile seizures, thrombocytopenic purpura, and measles inclusion body encephalitis in persons with demonstrated immunodeficiencies. But demonstrated immunodeficiencies, right? If you don't have immunodeficiencies, then all these side effects are almost guaranteed not gonna show themselves in you, right? Like I said, 50 years of licensure, 100 million doses administered worldwide each year. And the number of side effects that we see is what? Single, double, maybe triple digit sometimes. That is a fantastic rate of effectiveness, man. That is fantastic. You got a better chance of being, you got a better chance of dying in a car accident than you do of having a side effect from a measles shot. Wild stuff, all right? So that's the data. And then the final objection that I anticipate people having is what I call my body is a temple theology. Because my body is a temple, I'm not trying to put anything in it and yada, yada, yada. Oh my gosh, bro. Y'all got to actually read the Bible, bro. Not just quote single verses out of their context. Back to the Bible to look at both of the your body is a temple verses in First Corinthians and see if in context they can be applied to vaccines. Let's see. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 16. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? Speaking to Christians. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy and you are that temple. All right. Now, the mainline argument people usually go with this is to say, my body's a temple. I got to treat it right. I'm not trying to put poison in my body. You see how they sneak in that premise that a vaccine is poison. They haven't proved it. That goes against all the scientific data that we have on vaccines, but we're just going to say that so that it fits our theology, right? Yay, not yay. Horrible. All right. And then they rip 1 Corinthians 3, 16 and 17 out of its context and say that destroy must mean using a vaccine, and Bob's your uncle. All right. But here's the thing, the passage here, this, when it says you are God's temple, this is talking about the church as a collective. The Greek word you here is in the plural form, not the singular. But even without knowing Greek, even without knowing the Greek, the context here makes it clear that this is talking about the church as a collective. All right. Because destroy, right? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. Destroying God's temple, the context refers back to verses 1 through 9 here, right? Brothers, I, brothers, couldn't address you as spiritual people, as people of the flesh. You're still of the flesh. While there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For in one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos. Are you not being merely human? Right? Paul then goes on to say that he, Apollos, and all the other teachers are actually on the same team, surprise, surprise, to build them up in Christ and in God. And from that, we come up to verse 16. You're God's temple, guys, and the Spirit of God dwells in you. God destroys those that destroy his temple. Don't do that. All right, so destroy in this context is speaking of jealousy, strife, and idolatry of teachers as the destructive force acting on the church. In other words, anyone who destroys God's temple, anyone who destroys God's collective people with jealousy, strife, and idolizing of teachers will himself be destroyed by God. And I've seen God play this out on people before. God takes his church seriously. And then 1 Corinthians 6:19. All right. So it's clear that 1 Corinthians 3, not about vaccines. Not about it. Shouldn't apply it to that. The context doesn't go there. What about the second one? 1 Corinthians 6:19. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. The main line here, I was bought with a price. And I don't think Jesus would want me to be shooting some poison into me. See, again, the equivocation of vaccines with poisons, right? Haven't argued for it. Goes against the scientific data, but we're going to say it because it makes our theology work. All right? Here in chapter 6, though, the instance of the term you is referring to the physical bodies of individual believers. How do we know that? Well, look at the previous context, right? The previous context here starts in 12, actually. All things are lawful for me, not all things are helpful, right? I won't be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, say the Corinthian church, but Paul's rebuttal, God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord, and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh from Genesis. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. So flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body, see how that works? See, the context here is about how the physical human body has a much higher purpose than our own pleasure and stimulation, food and sex. And that sexual sin is a sin against the body, a dishonoring of the body, which also dishonors the Holy Spirit who makes that body his temple. It also dishonors the purchase of Father and Son by the blood of the Son over that body. But neither of, this and 1 Corinthians 3, they don't have any application of vaccines. That's not what their context is about. That's not what the context is about. So if that's what you're saying, you're already wrong. Like, that's not what those verses are about. You're taking the scripture out of context. And the third objection, the final objection, I guess that was the third. This will be the fourth, I think. It's just being unsure of the data, right? I'm not sure. I'm just kind of suspicious. I don't know. I just want to play it safe. Listen, man. Listen, man. If you actually wanted to play it safe, what you would do is you would research. You wouldn't put your head in the sand. You wouldn't put your head in the sand and just not try to get to the truth. All right? Proverbs 26, 12 to 16. Let me show you what I mean. Proverbs 26, 12 to 16. Do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. The sluggard says, there is a lion in the road. There is a lion in the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. The sluggard, that's a lazy person if you can't tell, buries his hand in the dish. It wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. The sluggard, the lazy person, is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. All right? Even fools, according to Proverbs, have more hope for wisdom than someone wise in his own eyes. This is not good. This is quite lost. All right? But some of the key traits we see of lazy people, we see that lazy people complain about exaggerated difficulties that justify staying home, not getting out and working. Right, verse 13, the lazy one says, there's a lion in the road, there's a lion in the streets. Yeah, no, there's not, buddy. You're just exaggerating the difficulties of life. All right? Um, I'd love to stay in bed. Verse 14, verse 15 is the one I want to focus on. The lazy person buries his hand in the dish, puts his hand in the food bowl, but it wears him out. It's just too much work to bring this food to my mouth to feed myself. Right? Lazy people can put their hand in a dish of food and think bringing it to their mouth to eat is too much work. Right? And all this sounds quite bad, but the truly terrible part is verse 16. The lazy person is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. But remember what it says about those that are wise in their own eyes back in verse 12. Do you see a man like that? You see a man who's wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. All right? Their laziness, right? And I want to press a bit, right? The laziness of the sluggard here in Proverbs 26 is fueled by their own sense of superiority, their own sense that they are wiser than all the wise counsel in their life. And so even when good food is given to them, and even if they put their hand to the dish, they won't bring it to their mouth. And what I'm talking about is knowledge here, man. Knowledge. You got this great deep dish of good food and bad food, but there's good food in the internet too. There's good knowledge here, right? And, we put our hands in here all the time. We as a culture put our hand in the knowledge dish of the internet all the time. But when it comes to actually bringing ourselves something good from the internet, all of a sudden that's too hard. That's too hard. If I need some stimulation, I can find that. I can find that. I can find my cat videos and my less than savory other kinds of videos with all manner of research. But if I'm trying to find something actually good for me, all of a sudden that's too hard to do. All right? When you say that you're unsure of the data, is that just something you say to cover up your own laziness to do any real research into the matter? I'm just curious. And only you and God would really be able to answer that. I'm just posing the uncomfortable question, right? But something to look at here, right? The outbreak of measles was actually traced mostly to some Mennonite communities, in West Texas, right? And there was something so interesting here when when a Mennonite pastor was asked to opine on this, right? You can see you see the article here from Cron. You can look it up. Mennonites aren't against vaccines, just like most other major religious groups, per reporting by the New York Times. Speaking out about the COVID vaccine, the U.S. Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches in 2021 said that, quote, our confession of faith and our current and historical practice do not provide the necessary rationale for granting a religious exemption based on the theological convictions of the denomination. Let me say that again. Even for the Mennonites, their confession of faith, their current and historical practice do not provide the necessary rationale for granting a religious exemption based on the theological convictions of the denomination. Right? Fair, the pastor, is one of many Mennonites in Gaines County who never took the COVID vaccine. Quote, it was very much that doubt that we had on the quickness of the vaccine that came out with just things that we were hearing about it. At the end of the day, that had nothing to do with our faith. What he means is the way that he read the Bible did not inform his position on not getting the COVID shot. Rather, it was his own lack of trust, his own distrust that led him to do that. When asked whether religious beliefs can influence healthcare, Fair said that some old colony Mennonites have cited the Bible to justify not taking the COVID and measles vaccines, specifically 1 Corinthians 3:16, which reads, "Do you not know that you're God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" But but we know that he can read the Bible, all right? You and I, we just went through 1 Corinthians 3:16. We know it doesn't say that. Listen to what this guy says. Quote, a lot of people will take these types of passages and they'll say that health is a personal matter, and it's not one where the government should dictate whether I take a shot or not, Fair said. Right? A lot of people will do that, but that's not true. He just said that, there is no rationale for a religious exemption, right? Uh, that rationale is not there even with 1 Corinthians 3:16. So he knows that people are wilding out with that. He knows. He knows that. Um, you know what I mean? So let me see. Was there anything else I wanted to get into down here before I took this down and kind of closed up shop on this? I don't think so. Yeah, no, that's it. But yeah, you know what I mean? Like, I just wanted to, I wanted to show you that because, people think people think that, you know, religion necessarily is what leads to this sort of thing. And no, it's what has always led to this lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge. And there's nothing in the Bible that says don't get knowledge. As I've gone through length in this episode to show, the only way you can walk out the wisdom in Proverbs 22:3 about being prudent, seeing danger, and hiding yourself is to actually engage with the real world, to actually engage in scientific investigation, to engage in investigating the real world so that you, with your own eyes, can see and verify dangers. And then you can see and verify what are good, reasonable ways to hide yourself and your loved ones from those dangers. All right. So, with everything being said, I would say that the wise thing to do, if you're a Christian that's doing their best to try to live up to, not live up to, but that's a very poor choice of words, that's trying to live according to the wisdom of God, right? Get your shots, man. Get your shots. Make sure your kids get your shots, right? As long as you're able-bodied enough to do it, right? If you got some sort of immunocompromising thing going on, if you're immunocompromised anyway, then, look into some different methods, all right? A vaccine's not going to help you, but for the vast majority of us, it will. For the vast majority of us, it will. And if in the Old Testament, quarantining was an expression of loving your neighbor as yourself, then I fail to see how taking a shot that doesn't require you to perform any kind of quarantining to tag along with it, I fail to see how taking a shot is not an extension of loving your neighbor as yourself when you're able-bodied enough to do it. When in the Old Testament, God instituted quarantine laws through Leviticus 13 to show love to his people. I fail to see how. All right. That's all I got for you this time. But stay tuned. All right. You want to stay tuned. I'm going to be having in the next week or so. We're going to be doing an interview on the Foreign Saints with a good friend of mine. A good Christian, solid Christian, that's been doing some work on the front lines in the Ukraine for advocating for the mental health of youth in Ukraine. You don't want to miss it. Try not to spoil too much of our conversation. Stay tuned, subscribe, hit that notification bell if you want to hear about any of that great stuff. Until then, I'm Saint K. This has been the Foreign Saints. Until next time, people, go in peace.